We were put in a position to fight all our lives. What made him think we wouldn't master the ring? We took the sweet science and gave it a new theory. Chances for the heavyweight title were few. This country needed to be knocked out into change. White promoters played and toured with this country's racial unrest. The Great White Hope. Many fighters never got the chance they deserved. White champions coveted the title. They wouldn't want to lose it. From the heart and the struggle of the true champions, this country's bigotries would fade into respect.
The journey of the African-American boxer has been a journey fought in the shadows of white fighters. Their struggle has been the struggle of all black Americans, one that grew from the seeds of slavery and took hold in a post-Civil War America when blacks gained their freedom.
Certainly, Reconstruction is a defining moment in African-American history in which blacks gained political rights in the South. And with those rights, whites, especially in the South, saw blacks gaining social equality.
Fearing what they saw, whites brought a quick end to Reconstruction. Blacks lost newfound freedoms, lynching became widespread, and segregation laws named after the minstrel show figure Jim Crow took effect. Thus emerged two separate, unequal societies, one white, one black.
It's all about fear and dread and control and anxiety, about black bodies, about black sexuality, about black power.
In sports, whites also feared black prowess, and for good reason.
Blacks had been dominant in the Kentucky Derby, I think winning something like 13 out of 15 Kentucky Derbies. Blacks also participated in baseball, and of course blacks were also involved in boxing and fought for championships at the lower weight divisions, but not at the heavyweight division.
You're in an atmosphere that's, on the one hand, with sports talking about fair play, but on the other hand, you have this incredibly racist environment in the United States where it's difficult for a black fighter to get a shot because so many white fighters are drawing the color line.
It starts in the 1890s with John L. Sullivan when he issues his open challenge to fight all comers, first come, first served, who are white.
Into this climate stepped Peter Jackson, a cultured British West Indian who had won the heavyweight title in Australia. Jackson had admirers as far away as America, where abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass kept the fighter's picture in his study. Even the American press held Jackson in high regard.
The National Police Gazette, which was the leading sports paper of the late 19th century in the United States, was fairly racist paper in many respects, but one of the things that it touted all the time was writing about black fighters and saying that they deserved a chance to compete for titles and so forth.
In 1888, Peter Jackson came to America in search of greater fame. After defeating white opponents and winning over white fans, he tried and failed to take on heavyweight champion John L. Sullivan.
I will not fight a Negro. I never have, and I never shall.
With no title at stake, Jackson settled for a match against gentleman Jim Corbett in 1891.
The two guys had a lot of respect for each other. Corbett was on a trajectory to fight for a title. Jackson was thinking he was on a trajectory to possibly fight for a title.
An interesting thing about Jackson, some people felt that his style against Corbett was somewhat cautious. A lot of people felt that the public would not accept a super aggressive black fighter, especially a super aggressive black fighter beating up a white fighter.
After 61 rounds, the bout ended in a draw. Despite Jackson's showing, it was Corbett who would fight for the title and become champion. A frustrated Jackson went to England, where he gained a measure of fame by winning the British heavyweight title. In the years to come, he had difficulty finding matches and rarely fought. At the age of 40, Peter Jackson died in Australia, never having fought for the world heavyweight crown.
The official cause, I believe, was tuberculosis, but some say that he gave up on life and didn't care and led a rather debilitating existence after the refusal of all these fighters to give him a chance.
Black fighters in the lightweight division break the color line when shadowboxing returns.
I think there's a tremendous paradox about racism in boxing that most people don't understand. That boxing was the first major sport, to its everlasting credit, that did allow some degree of equal opportunity. George Dixon became a champion 50 years before Jackie Robinson played for the Brooklyn Dodgers.
George Dixon was born in Nova Scotia, but he mastered his boxing skills in the United States, winning the featherweight championship and becoming the first black fighter to hold an American title. But even as champion, Dixon was constantly reminded of his race.
He was in fights where he would have to box in ring center, because if he boxed around the perimeter of the ring, there were actually fans, ringsiders, who would club his calves and his shins with blackjacks. And as a result, he became a master boxer who could fight in a small circle without using the ring.
In 1892, the Olympic Club of New Orleans staged the famous Carnival of Champions, a three-day fight card in which John L. Sullivan, Jack McAuliffe, and George Dixon defended their titles. In keeping his crown, Dixon bloodied white challenger Jack Skelly over 8 brutal rounds. The local press was unforgiving.
The press's reaction in New Orleans was not so much condemning the fact that a black had fought a white, but condemning the fact that a black had beaten up a white. And as a result, there were no more mixed matches in most of the South for 60 years.
Oh, this is the era of Jim Crow, of rigid segregation, discrimination, exclusion of blacks from all elements of American life and citizenship. Plessy v. Ferguson, which is the decision by the Supreme Court in 1896, establishes separate but equal, which basically says that discrimination against blacks, even at the state level, is okay.
Like most black fighters of his time, Dixon went north in search of mixed matches. He won a string of title defenses until losing his crown in 1900 to a white challenger, Terry McGovern. By then, Dixon's riotous lifestyle had brought about his downfall.
People have to understand the sporting life at this time for blacks, the jockeys, the boxers, the people in vaudeville, they were all hanging out together. This was a pretty rough crowd. You know, they liked to drink, they liked to carouse, they liked the women. He hung out with that crowd too and didn't maintain himself as well as he should have, and that's the reason, as with many others, his career ended.
Much as George Dixon fought his way out of the shadows in the late 19th century, Panama Joe Gans triumphed at the start of the 20th century, holding the lightweight crown for 6 years. Gans had gotten his start in battle royals, racist spectacles held over from slavery, when male slaves were collared and ordered to beat each other, all for the amusement of Southern plantation owners.
You got into the ring with 4 or 5 other kids. Sometimes they were blindfolded, sometimes they weren't. And you all beat the crap out of each other. Whoever survived was given some money, and he was discovered in this way. He learned his craft in this way.
Joe Gans, his first fight was a battle royal. He won $5 for outlasting the other 7 or 8 guys in the ring. And this was done in Baltimore by his first promoter.
Promoters held the key to getting title bouts, and often they took advantage of fighters, especially blacks.
They had a fight in the other guy's hometown. They lost decisions they should have won. Great black fighters like Joe Gans had to take dives in title fights.
After Gans lost a legitimate fight to lightweight champion Frank Earn in 1900, his only chance of getting a rematch was to take a dive against Terry McGovern.
He went down in the second round against Terry McGovern, and all the bettors knew it. Joe Gans went down and out in round 2, and everybody cashed in their tickets.
There was no choice for any black fighter at this time but to go along because whites controlled the game. What else were you going to do? I mean, it wasn't as though there was some alternative you can go to.
It's hard to assess what he would have done without being handcuffed in the ring. But Joe Gans was unbelievable. His defense, his jab. I mean, here is a man that invented it. He was that good.
A black heavyweight finally gets his chance. His name is Jack Johnson. Shadowboxing continues in a moment. Defiant, gifted, reckless, hated, and loved. Jack Johnson was as talked about as any American figure of his time. The son of a former slave, Johnson grew up in Galveston, Texas in the late 19th century when blacks were forbidden even to use the same sidewalks as whites. In his teens, Johnson fought in clubs as far away as Chicago, always in the shadow of white fighters and always for little pay.
Johnson got the idea that the only way to make money in the sport was to move out of the Negro leagues, if you want to look at it that way, to move in to fighting whites at the highest possible level.
But in the early 1900s, blacks were still denied heavyweight title fights. When James J. Jeffries successfully defended his crown against Jim Corbett in 1903, he kept the color line drawn.
I will not fight a Negro. If the public declares that I should fight Johnson, I will surely have to decline.
Jeffries continued to boycott black challengers right up until the day he retired as champion in 1905.
The heavyweight championship, because of the retirement of James J. Jeffries, was really down in terms of appeal.
At the same time, Johnson discovers that there's no longer any money fights in the Negro leagues, and so he sees this as a window of opportunity.
Johnson's biggest break came when the vacated heavyweight title fell into the hands of the lackluster Canadian Tommy Burns.
So Johnson says, now I can get my shot. He follows Burns to England. He doesn't get it. He follows Burns to Australia. Burns has a couple matches and says, what the hell? Why not fight Johnson?
So, for $30,000, Tommy Burns agreed to take on Jack Johnson for the world heavyweight title.
Johnson comes out against Burns, and in the early rounds, it's clear that it's a mismatch. And Johnson starts to taunt Burns, playing with the racial symbolism of the day, saying, come on, hit me in the stomach, Tommy, hit me in the stomach, thinking that blacks couldn't take punches in the stomach and Burns would pound away at his midsection and it wouldn't bother Johnson. And then Johnson slowly began to pick up the fight and inflict more physical damage. By the 12th, 13th round, Burns had pretty much had enough. He had been beaten fairly severely.
Before the police stopped the fight in the 14th round, they ordered the film cameras also stopped, lest there be a record of a black man knocking out a white man. But history had been made, and Jack Johnson now wore the crown that had once belonged to Jeffries, Corbett, and Sullivan. John L. Sullivan himself, guest reporting for the New York Times, was enraged by the outcome.
The Negro can't assume that title. I can't see where Johnson will be given a high position in the opinion of the general American public.
Boxing is known as the manly art or the sweet science, and blacks were not supposed to have the mental capacity to succeed at that kind of activity. Well, Jack Johnson proved them wrong.
But the white press simply couldn't accept the fact that there was a black heavyweight champion, much less an uppity black heavyweight champion. And a writer as great as Jack London became famous for writing the line that Jim Jeffries had to come out of retirement and wipe that smile off Jack Johnson's face.
That said, promoter Tex Rickard summoned the overweight, out-of-shape ex-champion Jim Jeffries from his alfalfa farm. Jeffries' mission? To defeat the man who defied the code of behavior laid down for blacks.
The idea that a black would even want to fight a white American and defeat a white American was preposterous. But then going beyond that, that he would want to date and marry and bed white women. In the South, they were lynching people for the mere wisp of such behavior, the thinking of such behavior.
Oh, Jack Johnson was an incredible symbol of black aspiration, ambition, success, achievement. He symbolized black power, black might, black resolve, and he stood up to whites in white arenas.
He's going through the South in his automobile at some 100 miles an hour, 90 miles an hour. He's going fast, well beyond the speed limits, and he's stopped by a white sheriff. And the white sheriff says to him, "You know, you were speeding." Johnson says, "Yes, I know that." He says, "That'll be $50. Johnson reaches in his pocket, pulls out a wad, peels off a $100 bill, and gives him a $100 bill. Johnson gets back in the car. Sheriff says, "You have change coming." Johnson says, "Keep the change. I'm coming back the same way I went through."
The greatest measure of Johnson's defiance came in Reno, Nevada on July 4th, 1910. For on that day, Johnson met America's great white hope, Jim Jeffries. Vicious anti-black sentiment ran through the mostly white crowd. Some even called for murder. "Let's hope he kills the coon," wrote Arthur Rule of Collier's magazine. To the dismay of Johnson's enemies, the fight was no contest.
There's an interesting sort of street poem that was authored by blacks. It became a part of black folklore and folk culture, which gives you some kind of indication of what Jack Johnson meant to ordinary blacks.
Amazing grace, how sweet it sounds. Jack Johnson knocked Jim Jeffries down. Jim Jeffries jumped up and hit Jack on the chin. And then Jack knocked him down again. The Yankees hold the play. The white man pulled the trigger, but it makes no difference what the white man say. The world champion's still a nigger.
The biggest race riot in this country after the Civil War was the rioting that occurred after Jack Johnson beat the Great White Hope. I mean, there were riots in New York, in Washington, Chicago, all across the country.
Unable to beat him in the ring, Johnson's enemies went after him with the letter of the law. His crime? Transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes.
And the Attorney General at the time said, no, that would be a perversion of the Mann Act. We won't use the Mann Act for that, to go after a single individual. And his representative in Chicago says, well, that's all we have. The Attorney General writes back and says, okay, if that's all we have, use it. Was he guilty? Of course he was guilty. He was a boxer who traveled around America. He traveled with women who weren't his wife. He traveled with prostitutes. Was he making money from them? Absolutely not. But on a very technical sense, he's guilty of a violation, as probably millions of other Americans were. The government didn't go after them. They went after Jack Johnson, and they got him.
Tried and convicted, Johnson fled the country and fought abroad for 2 years. Then, in 1915, in need of money, he arranged to fight Jess Willard in Havana, Cuba. It was rumored that Johnson had offered the U.S. government a deal. For $30,000 and safe return to America, he would lose. The deal fell through. and an aging Johnson battled Willard under a blazing sun, finally going down in the 26th round. In the words of a New York Times article, Willard has restored pugilistic supremacy to the white race.
Jack Johnson had an incredible legacy. When he lost the championship in 1915, another black would not fight for the title for 22 years.
The color line is redrawn in the heavyweight division when shadowboxing returns.
Johnson drew the reverse color line and fought mainly white fighters because that's where the money was. Two black fighters fighting each other weren't going to generate the kind of dollars that Jack could get by fighting white opponents.
That Jack Johnson wanted easy matches and easy money meant that the most deserving black challenger of the day, Sam Langford, would be forced to box in the shadows with little hope for a title shot.
Sam Langford was possibly, just possibly, the greatest fighter who ever lived. Here was a man who weighed anywhere from 145 to 160 pounds, and within a short time, very few heavyweights would risk their undefeated record or risk the title against him.
Chasing white fighters to get a match, Langford sometimes had to submit to a fix, even in a non-title bout. Such was the case in 1910 when he faced middleweight champion Stanley Ketchel.
Langford was told not to hurt Stanley Ketchel, and Ketchel, midway through the fight, decided to try and knock out Sam Langford. Langford, in the course of defending himself, just brutalized Stanley Ketchel, but held back from knocking him out.
The fight was ruled a no decision, and despite Langford's cooperation, he never got a chance to fight for Ketchel's crown. Instead, Langford fought other black boxers over and over. 10 times each against Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette. 18 times he fought Harry Wills, who had become a contender in 1915, the year Jack Johnson surrendered the heavyweight crown to Jess Willard.
Willard combined two death blows for a champion. Number one, he had no personality. He was a boring fighter, and outside the ring, he was a boring person. Number two, he was cheap, and he didn't like people that much. And so, as a champion goes, this guy had no charisma. He was almost, he dealt in negative charisma.
With Willard an uninspiring champion, Tex Rickard, the man who promoted nearly every title bout for 2 decades, went looking for a star. He found one in Jack Dempsey, a former hobo who was as comfortable in a barroom brawl as he was in a ring skirmish. In 1919, Dempsey took the heavyweight crown from Jess Willard, and after the victory, redrew the color line.
The white crop at that particular time was fairly dismal, and it means for Rickard, you're going to have a succession of fights with Dempsey winning, and the longer the person holds the championship, the more invincible he seems, and the easier he is to promote.
While Dempsey feasted on white challengers, Harry Wills rose to the top of the heavyweight division.
Harry Wills was the best black heavyweight during the time that Jack Dempsey was the heavyweight champion of the world. There was a certain feeling amongst people in boxing that Wills deserved a shot.
The New York State Athletic Commission thought so too and ruled that Dempsey had to fight Wills. The two signed a contract, but political pressure forced a second vote.
The New York State Athletic Commission, is then constituted of 3 men, voted 2-1 they would not allow that fight with a black man.
And so Dempsey broke the contract in favor of a bout against white fighter Gene Tunney and a $700,000 payday. Wills was the odd man out.
The Dempsey-Wills fight was one of those great fights that probably, even at the time, people on the inside knew would never happen. Rickard didn't think it would make money. Dempsey didn't really care.
By the late 1920s, Wills's talent began to decline. But he had planned for life after boxing, having invested in property in Harlem and becoming a well-to-do businessman. A much different fate for Wills's longtime rival, Sam Langford.
In fact, Sam Langford, half-blind, wants a fight, goes to see Jack Dempsey and Doc Kearns. And Doc Kearns says, Sam, we really were looking for somebody easier. He was that good, even late in life.
Sam Langford never did get the title shot he had coveted during his 24-year career. In retirement, he went totally blind, and efforts were made to restore his sight.
Well, Sam, tell me, how long have you been ill?
I've been here for the last 5 years. And I tell you, boys, it's great to be able to see again. When you can get out and look at the birds and the young girls going by.
Eventually, he disappeared, and he was found in the early 50s, half-starved, living in a cellar in Boston. And they interviewed him, and Langford was an unusual man. He was never bitter. He said, well, I've got my guitar, I've got my memories, I'm okay.
Joe Louis emerges from the shadow of white fighters and changes America inside and outside the ring. Shadowboxing returns in a moment. As America suffered through the Great Depression of the 1930s, the sport of boxing lost much of its appeal.
At the time, the heavyweight division was in doldrums. Max Baer was the heavyweight champion, not a particularly good one. Primo Carnera was a mob-controlled fighter who had held the title for a while and was absolutely terrible as a fighter. There was nobody out there with the skills or the personality to draw a big crowd.
But a world away in the Jim Crow South, a young black man would change all that.
Joe Louis was born in Alabama, barely had any schooling there at all before his family moved to Detroit. When he moved to Detroit, he was big for his age. He had a speech impediment, and school was a frightening, intimidating place for him.
The one place where Louis felt at home was in the ring. As an amateur, he blew away nearly every opponent and drew the attention of Detroit numbers man John Roxborough. Roxborough teamed up with associate Julian Black to manage Louis, and the two brought their hot prospect to meet Chicago trainer Jack Blackburn.
And Blackburn said, I don't want any part of training a black heavyweight. We both know he's not going to get a shot at any good fights. You know that he's going to be set up to lose. And Black and Roxborough assured Blackburn that they would provide the financial backing to make sure that Louis had a chance at actually winning his fights. And Blackburn reluctantly agreed to take him on for a couple of weeks. It was the middle of the Depression. He needed the money.
With Blackburn in his corner, Louis turned pro in 1934 and quickly became a contender. His first fight, a one-round knockout of Jack Kraken, was followed by 17 more wins in less than a year.
Well, Joe, as your manager, I'm going to do everything possible to get you a chance to fight for the championship. Thank you.
His manager set a list of rules. Joe would never be photographed with white women. Joe would never show emotion after beating an opponent. This was all fine and dandy and painted a good image, but the fact is, it really was Joe Louis. He was the anti-Jack Johnson.
Even so, Louis had difficulty breaking the color line of the big-time New York boxing scene, until he met ticket scalper turned promoter Mike Jacobs.
Mike Jacobs realized that Joe Louis was the best heavyweight talent out there, and despite Louis's color, was willing to take a chance on him. Jacobs was able to negotiate a fight at Yankee Stadium with Primo Carnera, the ex-heavyweight champion of the world, who was a 6'6", 250-pound stiff.
In dropping Carnera to his knees 3 times in the 6th round, Louis's New York debut was a sensation with the press, but he couldn't escape being written about in the context of his race.
Jack Cuddy called Joe Louis the Black Menace, the Dark Destroyer, the Golden Puma, and last, the Brown Bomber, which was the name that really stuck with Joe Louis.
After knocking out former champion Max Baer in 1935, Louis was on his way. A year later came his next big fight against Germany's Max Schmeling.
1936, Yankee Stadium, New York. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, beats former heavyweight champion Max Schmeling of Germany in a scheduled 15-round bout.
What was supposed to be an easy warm-up to Louis's title shot against James Braddock turned into an upset.
That right cross hurt Louis. He's Rocky. Louis is down. official timekeeper is counting the seconds across the ring. That's it, it's a knockout.
My mother said that he was devastated. He came back to the room and he felt that he'd let down all of America, and particularly black America.
As despondent as Lewis was, he quickly rebounded. In 1937, he beat James Braddock to become the first black heavyweight champion since Jack Johnson, 22 years earlier. Like Johnson, Lewis rarely faced black challengers.
Joe Louis defended his title 25 times. Only twice did he defend against black men. John Henry Lewis in his first defense, and Jersey Joe Walcott. The rest of his challengers were white.
If Joe Louis had spoken out against racism, no one would have listened, and he would not have gotten the chance to win over white America. He was, just by standing up, just by getting in the ring with white fighters, Lewis was the most militant black man in the world.
Lewis was never more militant in training than when he was getting ready to face Max Schmeling for the 1938 rematch. With Adolf Hitler marching through Europe, Lewis had unwittingly become a national symbol of freedom and democracy. President Roosevelt even called Lewis to the White House.
He felt my muscles and said, these are the type of muscles we're going to need to beat Germany with.
You almost had the feeling that whoever won this fight would win World War II.
Crushing right explodes on Schmelling's jaw, and Max goes down for the third time. It doesn't look like Schmelling's going to make it. It's all over.
It was like the end of the war. It was really a feeling that we've won. In Harlem, of course, it was all of the New Year's Eves of the 20th century rolled into one glorious night.
That fight made Joe Louis. It made him an instant legend.
That's when he transcended from being the heavyweight champion of the world to a true American hero. The irony, of course, was that he was representing freedom and democracy across the world when he couldn't live those freedoms or democracy.
You cannot talk to any African American who was alive in the 1930s without their talking about the impact that Joe Louis had on their lives.
When I was a teenager, black youngsters had no symbols of success to which they could turn. Joe Louis became our symbol of achievement. He became our idol.
Even though the gate is opening for some black fighters to emerge and really become superstars, there's a quota. I mean, there's just a system where we're not going to let too many come in.
Some black fighters overcame the racial barriers simply because they were so good. Sugar Ray Robinson, clearly the greatest fighter of all time, was an example, as I think was Henry Armstrong. No one ever threw more punches. No one ever had the stamina. No one could fight as hard, as frequently as Henry Armstrong. And he was just a crowd favorite.
Armstrong was born in Mississippi and raised in St. Louis. During the Depression, he found a job on a railroad, but he wanted to be a boxer. And one day he up and quit, announcing to coworkers, "I'm coming back in a Cadillac."
He went to Chicago, was unsuccessful there, and finally received some kind of offer to travel across the country and go to Los Angeles. Got there and probably never would have gotten a lot of opportunities had he not drawn the attention of the great Al Jolson, who bought his contract for $10,000.
Jolson backed Armstrong after seeing him defeat Baby Arizmendi in 1936. Jolson had picked a winner. Armstrong was unstoppable, becoming featherweight champion and then challenging Barney Ross for the welterweight title.
The winner and new world featherweight champion, Armstrong.
Later that year, Armstrong beat Lou Ambers for the lightweight crown and became the first fighter, white or black, to hold 3 different titles at the same time.
The great fear by the 40s was that blacks would take over most of the championships.
No boxer stirred up more fear than the best pound-for-pound fighter of them all, Sugar Ray Robinson. Following in the footsteps of his idol, Henry Armstrong, Robinson was lighting up the boxing scene.
In November 1942, the Ring magazine ratings came out, and the #1 welterweight contender was Ray Robinson.
But Robinson would have to wait for his shot at the title. World War II had taken its toll on boxing. 4 of the sport's champions had enlisted, including heavyweight king Joe Louis, and every title was frozen.
While Ray Robinson was the uncrowned, and that was how they called him, the uncrowned champion, he couldn't get a shot for at least a justifiable reason.
He had already beaten various welterweight champions. Fritzy Zivic, Marty Servo, Red Cochran. They wouldn't give him rematches for the title. He had to fight middleweights like Jake LaMotta and give away 20 pounds because he could not get a shot at the welterweight title. And this is the greatest fighter who ever lived.
In 1946, after a 4-year wait, Robinson got his title shot when he beat Tommy Bell for the vacant welterweight crown. Though now welterweight champ, Sugar Ray had his eye on the more lucrative middleweight title. But he refused to cooperate with the mob, which controlled title fights during Robinson's era.
Robinson's independence, his unwillingness to bend an inch with the mob, I think is an act of both personal courage and artistic purity.
Robinson's avoidance of the mob left him on the sideline, while the middleweight title passed between Rocky Graziano, Tony Zale, Marcel Cerdan, and Jake LaMotta. Finally, Sugar Ray went to Joe Glazer, a music promoter with mob ties. In 1951, Glazer helped broker a title fight against Jake LaMotta, who had ducked Robinson for 2 years.
Robinson finishes up with lefts and rights from all angles. Referee Sakura steps in and stops the fight, awarding the victory and world's middleweight championship to Sugar Ray Robinson.
With his victory, Robinson had become bigger than boxing and bigger than the mob. He could now dictate the terms of its fights.
But others had to wait much too long, and some, like Charlie Burley, never got title fights because they came along the same decade as Ray Robinson.
Burley boxed in Sugar Ray Robinson's shadow, always a few notches behind him in the rankings.
I think the difference between Sugar Ray and Charlie Burley was they were both great fighters, but Sugar Ray had that little bit extra, the charisma, that allowed him to take his personality beyond the ring. Charlie Burley didn't have that going for them. So if you had 2 great fighters and one you were going to give a break and the other you were going to screw, you would give the break to Sugar Ray because he had the charisma that Burley lacked.
Like Charlie Burley, the Cincinnati Cobra, Ezzard Charles, lacked the flash of Sugar Ray Robinson.
Ezzard Charles was one of the great fighters and the most unappreciated fighter of all time. And he was, I think, symptomatic of the whole essence of boxing. As a middleweight, almost all winning. As a light heavyweight, better if possible. He couldn't get a shot at anyone.
By the time he was 20, Charles had beaten Charlie Burley twice. He later defeated Archie Moore, and then against the ever-dangerous Lloyd Marshall, he went down in the 2nd round and came back to win. But Charles suffered a tragic victory in his 1948 match with Sam Baruti.
Unfortunately, his career goes south in terms of his desire when he kills Sam Baruti in the ring.
Distraught over Baruti's death, Charles briefly retired. When he returned, he got what had eluded him during his prime fighting years, a shot at Joe Louis's heavyweight title. With the end of World War II, America inched closer toward integration.
In the 40s, it's not quite so socially acceptable in many circles to be so virulently racist as you might have been back at the turn of the century.
Boxing corrected its sins a lot quicker than the Supreme Court. Because after the war, they began to allow blacks to move up through the ranks and challenge.
In large measure, Joe Louis was responsible for America's new racial consciousness.
Joe Louis doesn't get nearly the amount of credit he should. All the credit that Jackie Robinson gets, I think Joe Louis should receive and more.
In holding the heavyweight title for 12 years with dignity and grace, Louis influenced white attitudes toward black Americans. Indeed, in 1949, the country was at a loss when its champion stepped down.
When Louis retired, they needed somebody to step into that role that Louis had enjoyed for so many years.
That somebody turned out to be Ezzard Charles. Having moved up to the heavyweight ranks, Charles beat the top challengers in the division, including Jersey Joe Walcott, and by all accounts was the new heavyweight champion. But Charles wasn't fully appreciated until 1950, when he defeated a recently unretired Joe Louis for the undisputed heavyweight title.
The fight's gone all the way, and an era ends as the bell sounds.
For the first time in boxing history, the heavyweight title passed from one black man to another black man.
So what? And since I won the championship, I feel very proud about it, and I'll try and do my best to keep it as clean as the previous fellow who just stepped down, Joe Louis. I'll try to be as much of a credit to it as he was.
Like Charles, the hardest luck fighter of all, Archie Moore, finally got his chance.
Almost all the racism of boxing comes together in Archie Moore's career of underpaid, have to fight in the other guy's hometown, give away weight, #1 contender for 10 years without a title shot.
Like Sugar Ray Robinson, Moore's biggest obstacle may have been his refusal to cooperate with the mob.
I never made friends with those kind of guys. And even though Frankie Carpo was supposed to be a gangster, I had nothing to do with him.
He was looking for a title shot, but never hooked up with the right people. And part of that hooking up with the right people was, in a sense, selling your soul to those people.
Ms. Willie Moore and Mr. Cleveland Moore gave me the right words to say when I was young. Say no anytime anyone asks you to do something that's tricky or whatnot or unfair. Say no.
For years, Archie Moore was a vagabond, traveling anywhere and everywhere to get a fight.
What Moore used to do was used to adopt hometowns. For one period, he had like 15 fights in Cleveland. Then he adopted Baltimore as his next hometown, and he had 20 fights in Baltimore, when he still didn't earn any money.
This is the biggest moment in Moore's life. It's his first shot at the title after 16 years in the ring, and after many years as top contender in the light heavyweight division.
When Moore finally did get a shot at Joey Maxim's light heavyweight title in 1952, he was at least 39 years old and a veteran of more than 200 fights.
And he had to take Joey Maxim's legendary manager, Doc Kearns, in as his new co-manager, who took 10% of all of his earnings after that, just to get the opportunity to box Joey Maxim for the title.
When Archie Moore finally did get a title fight, beating a very colorless champion in Joey Maxim, I believe he took home about $800.
I won the championship in the ring. And so now, here's my trainer running over to me and trying to pick me up in the air. I said, "Cut me loose." Be cool. Don't get excited. There's nothing to be excited about. I could have won this thing 12 years ago.
In 1955, through Moore's own efforts, he finally got a heavyweight title fight. Though well past his prime, he was convinced that the champion, Rocky Marciano, had been ducking him. Moore spent $50,000 on a letter writing and advertising campaign to shame Marciano into a title defense. Moore managed to knock Marciano down in round 2, but the champion recovered and shattered Moore's dream of a heavyweight crown.
There he goes, in his own corner.
And then in '58, when he's probably 43, 44 years old, he has one of the most sensational fights in history with Yvonne Durrell defending his title.
Well, the Yvonne Durrell fight actually is the fight that made me a boxing fan. When I was a kid, my father let me stay up to see it, and I'd seen some snatches of boxing before, but nothing like this.
Durrell came in with a beautiful right-hand shot, and Moore is down again.
Archie Moore gets knocked down 4 times early in the fight. In his 40s, comes back and knocks out Yvonne Durrell.
Moore back after him once again. And down he goes again with a clubbing right hand. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, struggling at 9, 10. He is out. Man, oh man, what a dramatic turn in this fight.
To me, Archie Moore's life is like a blues song. Whenever I see films of him, I think of Robert Johnson, the great black Mississippi blues singer. That's the kind of feeling you get when you look at the whole career of Archie Moore and the discrimination he suffered, the lack of recognition. He was everything you want from a fighter, a boxer, a puncher, crafty, quick, a great interview. He's like a lost treasure to me.
Archie Moore's career symbolized the struggle of African-American fighters. Boxing in the shadows of whites, some became champions, others were denied. All of them helped pave the way for blacks seeking equality inside and outside the ring.